So judging against the same topic.
Yes, I will say.
Sabri.
What are we seeing here?
So everyone.
Can you type? Write it down.
Don't wanna leave. We shouldn't be doing this shit.
It's just in this chat. Thank you very
That's for round?
These are ball games. We get it. We got it. Yeah, sure. You guys thank you. See if we can download my
I welcome you to quarterfinals of ABP 2015. We have IIUM 1 as we have IIUM 3 as OO. We have Mara 2 as we have Ateneo 1 as CO. I'm Avinash, I'll be the chair for this round. Judging with me are Lucas, Sam, Chanel, and J Park. I request the teams to keep to not drown the speakers when they say something good or something bad. And I request the teams to keep keep their table talk to a minimum. Now request the Prime Minister to begin this debate.
This debate happens in the most Islamophobic of societies. Countries such as Hungary, where there has already been bipartisan support to take out any woman's ability to wear hijab. We are talking about countries such as France as well, where often we have seen synagogue attacks because of anti-Semitism rise. We're talking about these situations where we have tried and yet failed with the confrontational approach of telling them we are here as minorities. But that has only had repercussions for ourselves. A few things that I want to talk about. First, we must understand that in this debate, obviously by fiat, we're able to say that the leaders will agree to a consensus on being able to push for those things, right? If they come up and say, oh no, some will disagree, that's not going to apply. But more importantly, we're, aside opening up, and we're happy to be consistent and going for all kinds of things. We're happy to be able to tell women, you know what? At this moment in time, it's not good for you to go ahead and wear the hijab or whatever, right? It's okay not to have mosques that single out that there are mosques. It's okay not to have like public azans. That's fine. Religion should be private, and we think that's in the long run better for everyone. Why? First argument that I want to talk about is the kinds of discrimination that essentially happen. But before I talk about that, we must understand this: that the point at which discrimination happens against a particular minority, that discrimination is objectively bad compared to the spiritual fulfillment, which may be subjectively good for some individuals. But second, even if that's the case, discrimination leads to obvious, not just short-term in the case of spiritual fulfillment, but long-term, which passes through generations and generations. Yeah. So, having said that, what does actually happen within these kinds of situations, in these kind of countries, right? We are talking about the point at which you are able to differentiate yourself and go ahead and put up your hijab and whatnot. The point is, it becomes easier to differentiate and therefore dehumanize you as a person. Therefore, easier to not make people feel empathetic towards you, which leads to the form of right-wing rhetoric that we see. What these guys will come up and say, oh, but they can still differentiate you sometimes. The difference is, it's always a spectrum. The more different you are, the easier it is to dehumanize you. So we think that part can actually take it out of this debate now. But second thing, ladies and gentlemen, what have we seen, right? We're also talking about the context where people are already fearful of minority religions. We're talking about terrorist attacks, already making them irrationally scared of any kind of like BS flying in at them. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that at this point in time, there's humongous amounts of silent discrimination that happens as well. But even worse, we have already seen women who wear hijab have been ripped, have had their hijab ripped off on the street, right? The level of Islamophobia isn't just something you read, oh, Islamophobia, something that might happen sometimes. It is every day on every single street you see within this kind of nation. It's an extreme situation that is happening. We must understand why. What happens in the long run, right? In the long run, we must understand, like this is short term and long run, the point at which they're able to discriminate you, it affects everyone. They're able to often take out welfare policies for minorities who are often poor, for them to ever be able to go ahead and climb the social ladder. This also means, ladies and gentlemen, you're able to go ahead and dehumanize them as scroungers who don't really belong to your society, who are making your society more evil, right? Criminals, that kind of a thing. But also, ladies and gentlemen, those are kinds of policies that in the long run remove the minority's ability to be able to mobilize and push for change when they slowly but surely lose political capital that essentially happens as a result of discrimination. We are not given a job and you can't promote yourself, that kind of thing. These kinds of short-term discriminations lead to really, really big long-term harm for you to push for change in the long run. No, thank you. And remember, what is also true is this, right? The point at which they can say, oh, but visibility is where we have acceptance. That's not true. We visibly saw women for a long amount of time, but still chose to discriminate against them, right? We don't think that necessarily happens. But we'll all actually argue that the kind of visibility that changes is when you're able to breach through that society and be able to be one of them as opposed to us versus them, right? The point at which you're inside the system is where you're able to get that promotion, where you're able to go ahead and break that barrier of us versus them mentality because you're different. That is the point at which you become humanized. That is the point at which you are listened to in a room because you're not the weird guy who nobody wants to listen to, right? It is only after that kind of like breaching the system and they actually change their minds. That is why we must get power first before we can ever go ahead and become confrontational to begin with. For example, secular Turkey, right? Humongous amounts of oppression on Muslim women. How did Erdogan go into power and slowly go for Islamic changes? The way he did this was to be seen as palatable first, right? He was not an extreme guy who is pushing his religion to your face. Once he gets into power, that is when it becomes more and more acceptable to listen to him because he's one of us. That is when how slowly he gets able to push for change once he is in power. It is only when you're palatable will you ever be listened to. Moving on. The second, right? Sure, go ahead.
So Muslims in Europe are fighting for the right to be able to wear hijab. Your proposal is to finish the job for the Islamophobe and rip the hijabs willingly.
Yes.
The thing is, it's not just about removing the hijab, because removing the hijab is just a part of what happens as a result of discrimination. It means you and your children can't get jobs. It means you and your children can't get a good public education. It's way more than the hijab, about the hijab, right? It's about what the hijab represents. Let me talk about that right now, right? Because he's gonna go like, oh guys, spiritual fulfillment. Let's talk about that, right? Remember, I already gave you the comparative as to why that's not enough. But even if, a few things that I want to say, right? A, we would think that God would understand the point at which reality isn't really nice to you. But more importantly, we would argue that currently it is actually coercive on individuals who are consistently told by their religious leaders that you must fulfill your religious obligations, even though that leads to a lot of unfair things being done to you. We'll argue that that is actually coercive and pressurizing these individuals. If anything, we'll argue the point at which leaders are able to say this, the meaning of your spiritual fulfillment changes, because you are told that it is not wearing the hijab that leads to spiritual fulfillment, but something else. In similar ways, for example, ladies and gentlemen, in the Bible it still says, if a woman wears two different clothes with the same clothing, she's gonna go to hell. Nobody ever follows that anymore because leaders were able to change how spiritual fulfillment can be gathered. So we don't think that's a harm that happens under their model. We'll also argue that even if some women get discriminated because they still don't listen and wear the hijab, there are two things that I want to say. One, under their model, the religious community still discriminate against people who don't wear the hijab, for example, right now. And we think that has to change, right? Because these are people who are, you are not being confrontational. That's bad. They're discriminated. But second, in the worst case scenario, smaller numbers of people differentiating themselves still make them less threatening because they're not large enough to like take over the country, that kind of thing. That also means smaller numbers of women, for example, wearing the hijab, is still seen as less threatening. Religions have changed over time to go ahead and make themselves relevant to a society. And by the way, religion is a tool to fight for your rights. And that has always been the case throughout history when Islam was used as religion for the poor to fight against the rich. This is a tool for people to be empowered. The point at which religion inhibits your ability to empower yourself, we think it's time to change religion. We're supremely proud.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech. I now call upon the Leader of Opposition to open the debate.
Here. We think Islamophobia still exists and still discriminates towards minority religions, even when they don't see these Muslims pray in public. In fact, inside opposition, we would contend that when they can't prove that I can be a practicing Muslim and be a moderate, this homogenization will actually exacerbate, and the discrimination towards Muslims will be even worse. In my speech, I'll talk about two major things. Firstly, why the disenfranchisement of these Muslims from practicing actually increases extremism. Secondly, how actually you worsen processes of integration at the end of the day when you don't allow for public practices of their faith. But before I move on to these responses, a few clarifications I feel need to be made in rebuttals are outstanding. Firstly, this idea that, look, it's an objective harm for you to be discriminated, but it is subjective harm for you to go to hell fire. Firstly, I don't think you have the right for you to decide the importance of these particular individuals to not abandon their faith, because they know that if they do, they will burn in hell. Even if the economy and power is discriminated against them, they know this, because despite the fact that there is Islamophobia, they enter into Europe and still want to be able to profess their faith, and it shows that they care about it a lot at the end of the day, right? But secondly, we would argue to you that when you remove the practicing of the religion, that's when you remove the spectrums of personalities in which people can prove that I am still a moderate regardless of my practices, which is also their idea of visibility. They say, look, but women are still visible, but they're still discriminated, right? But the fact is, because women can still be women, because there's something unique about them, because the fact that they can still be pregnant and all those things, right? But there are spectrums of feminism. The fact is, they can still profess that I am from different spectrums, despite the fact that I'm inherently a woman. This principle also applies to when you are a Muslim who goes to pray and who goes to Jummah and fast during Ramadan at the end of the day, right? But thirdly, we think what they're doing is pandering the rhetorics of the bigots instead of empowering the moderate NGOs that already exist in order to protect these Muslims' rights to practice. For example, NGOs that help give aid towards individuals to fight for their case in the European Court of Human Rights. You regret these individuals and ban it towards Hungarian dictators who want to be bigoted, and that's why we think that it's harmful at the end of the day. But in terms of economic empowerment, right, we will argue to you that these individuals will still be homogenized, discriminated based upon things like skin color. But I was telling you, but look, at least now they'll be different on a different spectrum, right? But look, but it doesn't make any difference, right? That's why we think it's better for you to be able to practice yourself in public and then to have your conversations with your colleagues. But that doesn't mean I'm extreme just because I pray. That will be my argument later on. Sit down. Let's talk about my arguments. Firstly, how exactly do you disenfranchise and increase extremism? Firstly, you have to understand, because these individuals are a minority within their communities, that means any form of an attack towards a religion will be further disenfranchising them. They will feel even more isolated from the society. What does this do? Because even if you clamp down public professions of faith, the fact is Ansem Chanduri, the most extremist person in the UK, can still preach these things in private and spread to you the fact that you are isolated within Europe. That's why you should fight for extremist groups like the Islamic State. That's why we should abandon this ideas of this secular ideals, because secular ideals always means the compromise of fundamental religious tenets. Secondly, I will also contend that they say, but look, religions change all the time. But firstly, you have to explain to us that this doesn't always change according to the progress that you want. For example, despite of hundreds of years of Muslims existing in society, if you don't pray, you are still being seen as less Muslim. The same way how even in Christian minorities, right, things like abortion is still seen as condemnable by the majority of these Christians. It's because these things are fundamental and not up to interpretation, as opposed to, when it comes to things like what clothes you wear if you're a nun, what clothes you wear if you're a Christian. It's still up to debate, even among clergy circles at the end of the day. So inherently what you're doing is disenfranchise them even further, especially because you are poor within these communities. They have no other source of jobs. You increase the opportunity to fight for the martyrdom and go to fight for all these things, to fight for ISIS at the end of the day, right? But secondly, also, you disempower moderates from practicing. You put them in an environment of fear, right? Because when the religious leaders tell them that, look, when you practice, you are not perceived as a moderate, that means these individuals who self-isolate themselves even more, even when they exist within those communities, they will be afraid to even talk to random white strangers at the end of the day, because the fact that they know that if I do this, it'll be against my faith, or they will dictate me for who I am and what I look like on the outside. And that's even worse at the end of the day for these individuals. Before I move on, yes, opening.
Look, how can you prove that I practice my faith and I'm still normal if you're not even accepted into the circle to prove that first?
No, because we feel, okay, this goes on to the second example, really. Why secular individuals is not the platform for you to integrate within this particular community, so why that's a bad platform. But before I move on, thirdly, also what happens is that you legitimize the rhetoric of otherness when you forward immigration policies or foreign policies. Because let's be clear here, these individuals are already stranding on the gates of Hungary or Greece, right? They can't go anywhere else. But the moment Fox News is able to say, because these guys say Allahu Akbar because they're thankful for their journey there, they are terrorists, you immediately impede them even further from being able to enter into this country and practice their faith. And at the end of the day, which makes it even harder for them to integrate within the societies. But secondly, because it's the most crucial aspect, because we all want these three individuals to integrate, how do we exactly integrate these individuals? Firstly, We don't think secular individuals are the right individuals to be able to integrate Muslims within the societies. Why? Because secular individuals are still seen as traitors to their religions. For example, liberal Muslims enter into parliament, extremist Muslims are going to say, but these people aren't really Muslims, they're moderate at the end of the day. Which means that people would still go towards extremist groups because they feel as if the liberal Muslims in these communities don't represent them, or the secular Muslims cannot represent them at the end of the day. Right? But secondly as well, we feel that integration is all the more better when these people are able to have conversations with each other. For example, if I wear a niqab and I go to work and my friend asks why you wear a niqab, then I'm able to have this conversation. That no, I'm wearing a niqab because of these particular things. Because besides that, even if these conversations don't happen, extremist rhetoric will still be prevalent in status quo, even if there are no public professions of faith. So people automatically fall into that preconceived notion anyway, as opposed to having legitimate moderate voices that are practicing that's both legitimate to the Muslims and the non-Muslims, to say that look, we are still moderate regardless of what we wear at the end of the day. This is what creates affinity and solidarity between individuals. That way, legitimize them as others, right? Because you don't want them to see you as just a friend, but see you as a friend regardless of whether or not you're Muslim. Because that's what upholds a verified idea of secularism that leads to diversity within these communities. But finally, as well, we will argue that even if integration doesn't happen, we find that it's better for these individuals to exist within those communities, even if they are isolated, like in a lot of the ghettos, but still survive and able to practice a fundamental faith, because sometimes they think their faith is the utmost important thing, as opposed to things like the promotion of their rights within parliament. We think they're the ones that facilitate the acts of extremist rhetoric and rip off the hijabs of our faithful Muslim movement for them. That's why I'm proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for his speech and now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to conclude the debate for opening up.
This is not a debate in which moderate Muslim NGOs are winning the battle and extremists are losing. In Hungary, Viktor Orban passed a myriad of laws which stampede your basic rights to liberty when it comes to religion. That currently there's a bill being debated to ban the hijab to begin with. Individuals on the streets are being assaulted on the basis of their religious identity, which can be seen. Welfare cuts upon Muslims who primarily dominate the underclass of society. That is the context in this debate. We do acknowledge that spirituality is subjective to us individuals. But in their world, even though I as a Muslim woman chooses not to wear the hijab, I will be homogenized, I'll be discriminated, I will also not get the job, even though I do not conform to the objective religious spirituality we just like to look upon. I am sorry that you will need to make some religious cuts on the status quo, but I think these cuts are necessary in order for you to integrate society in the long run when you have that political capital, something we think completely ignored in this debate, the long-term change. No capital. 3 questions in this speech. Arguments integrated. 1. Let's look at discrimination and the balance of harms here. Zim told you in rebuttal that guys, spiritual harm is also objectively bad upon that person. Therefore, you cannot just say that, oh, me losing welfare and job is something which is objectively bad. That misses the comparative. 2 reasons why that misses the comparative. 1, often Mubarak told you, individuals who wear the hijab, I do acknowledge some of them do it out of genuine choice, but you also cannot ignore the other groups. Individuals who are guilt-tripped by imams in the European Union, you say that if you do not do so, you will go to eternal damnation. Those are individuals which this side completely disempowered. Second response here. I do acknowledge, ladies and gentlemen, that some Muslims, if they do not wear the hijab, they will see themselves to be subpar. But there are Muslims like me, and a lot of Muslims IIUM as well, who do not believe that my spirituality is up to some objective codified system. The comparison is almost everyone, ladies and gentlemen, regardless, even that individual who doesn't want to wear the hijab, wants to have a job, wants to ensure that I can get welfare, wants to ensure that my child can get subsidized education. That means you harm all Muslims through your policy of homogenization. That's the second comparison. The third comparison is this. Welfare harms, subsidy cuts, job cuts, the harms are intergenerational. This is my new extension here. If you as a father loses your job, loses your home and property, more likely that transfer of wealth will not go towards your children. Your children will be poor, ladies and gentlemen. In comparison to a spirituality, even Hazan knows this. You cannot transfer your pahala or your religious conduct towards your son. It is untransferable. But wealth and the rest will lead to a perpetual discrimination in the long run. That's why fathers who suffer from slavery, their grandchildren still suffer until today. That intergenerational harm is objectively bad, harms future generations as well. You've gotten your time? No. Conclusion here, ladies and gentlemen, our policy is more important than the comparative in comparison to theirs. The next thing Zim told us, but guys, now religious leaders from the outside, like IS members, will now gain more support, and these people will spread the messages of tyranny. 3 responses. 1. On the comparative, religious leaders outside are much weaker than religious leaders inside because you have less contact time, no face-to-face interaction. Previously, ladies and gentlemen, I do not go to that mosque. I talk, imagine Mubarak as an imam, I talk to him, I build that relationship of trust. I wasn't like, oh, Mubarak said this, fuck Mubarak, I'm going to move somewhere else. Come on, man, it's not that easy. It's not really about spirituality, it's also about brotherhood and friendship. Second response, no. Often, Muslims care about religion, which is contextualized. That's why in Malaysia, we have our own religious spiritual bodies. In Turkey, you have your own spiritual bodies, which means that we create our own contextualized laws. I'm more likely to follow the law of the land in comparison to saying, I'm just going to follow IS. But thirdly, it's a ridiculous assertion to say that suddenly you agree these leaders are moderate. Suddenly you'll go like, oh, my leader says this, who you yourself can see, you're a good leader, moderate leader, and I'm a moderate person. Oh fuck, you forget moderation. Extremism. Like even if that is to happen, the small majority would do it anyway. Because the religious say, oh, niqab is not compulsory. We go like, oh no, that person said niqab is not compulsory, I support IS. Obviously that's not the group of people who we are talking about in this debate. Finally, they say, oh guys, discrimination will still happen because I'll discriminate on the skin color. 2 things. 1, I'm a Muslim, people don't think I'm Muslim because I don't look like Muslim. Skin color in this world is like mixed, like I'm beige. No one can discriminate me because of my skin color. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, people don't discriminate because of skin color. People discriminate because of your practice, of the religious practice, not on the color of your skin. So we think that's a ridiculous assertion in this debate. Yes.
So at least when extremist status quo say their extremist rhetorics, they are accountable to the moderate Muslim public. But when it happens in private, how do you ensure that these people don't go extreme?
No. We are saying that these religious leaders should go public and tell those individuals to not give arguments, even if it's through religious justifications, i.e. we already Masalah Mursala, which states that if you are in a position of desperation, you can opt out from that religious practice, just as your Mubarak told you. That religion has evolved since time immemorial, something we've been completely ignored in this debate. Second clash. How does our policy generate long-term change? Zin told us that visibility alone is insufficient. Notice how states like Texas and Arizona, with the most amount of immigrants, suffer the most amount of discrimination, even though visibility between whites and those Hispanics are there. This means that visibility alone is insufficient. Our policy pushes for the equilibrium, in which visibility is complemented with equality, in which I see you as an equal to me, I don't see you as a different person. But more importantly, the best way for change to happen is when I as a Muslim has a job, I'm working that person, earning the same wage, living next to him. That's why I can have slow, subtle discussions in comparison to them focusing on my differences first, even though I don't even know who the hell you are. The example of Turkey was particularly pertinent. I know this is Turkey is a Muslim country, but I know that at the time of Kemal Atatürk, it was the most secular country in the world, in which even the hijab was banned to begin with. But in the long run, those subtle changes in which you see Muslim leaders having the same amount of wealth, amount of political votes, lobbying powers. That's when slowly you make subtle changes in which Islam is able to flourish in comparison to focusing on the differences to begin with. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, what we will say is because I do acknowledge in their world, there'll be some Muslim women who fuck it, I still want to wear hijab. I acknowledge that. But those individuals will benefit a lot more on the policy. Because now those individuals do not, once you have 1 million Muslims doing it, often the whites go oh my god, you're taking over my country. Smaller portion of people means you're able to exercise your freedom a lot more. We think those will be legitimized. But finally, the comparative in this debate is far worse. In your world, you are looking at a world in which those religious practices will be banned, which means there's a law to ban it to begin with. Which means it's much harder for social changes to be pushed in comparison to our world, with sentiments or silent discrimination in which you can change in the long run when you are able to garner political capital. I'm sorry, I'm from IIU, I know that this is bad, but subtle changes must be made for the Ummah, for Muslims, and also for treating minorities, I support this motion.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech and now call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Here, here.
Sadiq and Mubarak think that because they're from IIUM and they can pronounce the word pahala, that they can lie in this debate and get away with it. The reality is, it is not as bad as Hungary in the entirety of Europe. Hungary may be a unique case, but in the UK, there are laws against discrimination against any religious minority. You can still bring a lawsuit against them. When a woman was in the bus and she started shouting out ISIS against a woman who was wearing hijab, other women rose to defend her within that bus. Welfare is still provided in most parts of the UK. And here's the thing, the majority of poor within the entire Europe is mostly not even Muslim. The vast majority of Muslims are educated people who work within high-class jobs, who contribute to the economy, and are knowledgeable and work as professors, lawyers, and doctors. These people will not be affected by your welfare policies. So these things aren't necessarily going to happen. So this imaginary world that Sadiq and Mubarak want to tell you, that things are so bad that we have to prioritize all these things. We're going to take away your welfare. So what? They don't need your welfare. We're going to take away all these things from you, simply does not exist. Just because of a few instances in Hungary, for example, that they can point to, does not make the entirety of Europe shameful for lying. Let's talk. There's three things. No, thank you. I'm going to say in my speech. One, why visibility necessarily equals the ability to eventually fight for those rights. Secondly, why the discourse can only happen under our side and not theirs. But finally, thirdly, the spiritual fulfillment that they necessarily negate. But finally, the comparative of when they will never achieve those rights at the point when those laws become instituted for the indefinitely. No, thank you. First, let's talk about visibility. We tell you that at the point when you are visible, like they gave the example of like, well, women have been visible for so long and we never gave them rights. The point is that women were never given their rights because they weren't visible in the marketplace. They weren't visible in places of political and business leadership. They weren't visible in the places. When they became visible and we gave them those rights to be visible, that's when they were able to achieve change. Under your model, you are taking away that visibility that garners the right and garners people to accept them and see, look, even though she was a woman, she was still being like accomplished and providing profit to the company and making all these things happen. Likewise, even though she's wearing hijab, she can still be a phenomenal debater and still be a very smart person who respects my right, but still have her own religious belief. That never happens when they never see your hijab, because hijab will always be associated with extremism and terrorism. The only place that they see hijab under their role is on the TV when Fox was just showing it in Afghanistan by Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We don't think that's the image of hijab we want to say. And this is the problem. At the point when that becomes the only image, sit down guys, at the point when this becomes the only image that people have of hijab, of beard, of praying in public, never mind the mosque they want to now destroy, this means that you will never be able to eventually fight for those rights to get them back. They're harm. They're basically saying, look, once we're in power, we're now going to be able to eventually fight for the right for people to eventually get those things back and eventually like allow for religious freedom, even though they're like fighting against any religious freedom now. The problem is that status quo, no thank you, becomes permanent when the only images those are associated with are people outside. No thank you, have a seat. So we think that's a massive harm that they have on their side. Let's talk about how discourse only happens on our side. Discourse won't happen for two reasons. One, no thank you. Discourse won't happen, one, because of Europeans who want to know more about Islam. We don't think people are inherently racist or bigoted. We think people are afraid of the unknown. We don't know what you are. We don't understand your religion because we don't know very much about it. But we are curious to find out. And we think that's the majority of people within the context of Europe. But the problem is that this majority of people will never have the incentive to actually come up to these people. Because at the point, first off, they won't know you're Muslim in the first place because you have no visible identifiers of your Islam or of your minority religion. But secondly, even to the extent that some people don't follow their religious leaders, this means that they won't go up to them because they are afraid because of all the images they see on TV. But the second reason why, even if these people are curious enough to still ask anyways, Muslims will want to talk to them because they've been told by their religious leaders in their mosque, you guys have to stay low.
These people don't like us. You are not welcome here, so don't talk to them about your religion. Don't talk to them about prayer. Don't talk to them about all the beliefs that actually do coincide with a lot of the values that Western Europeans actually do have, but you need to hide that part of yourself and basically whitewash yourself to the point where there is absolutely no diversity within the country at all. That is the only way for you to be able to succeed. At the point when these people ingrain that sort of mentality within themselves, they will never want to talk and have those dialogues and discourse that are so necessary in order to change public opinions about what Islam is and to eventually get acceptance of religious freedoms. I'll take closing.
The motion presumes that public displays of faith are contentious and people are apprehensive of these religions. So in the instance where people homogenize Islam with being terrorists, what incentive or interest do they have in approaching a man who prays?
The motion presumes no such thing. The motion presumes that some people have a problem with it, and that there are, like some instances, like the opening government said, it is your job to prove that that is the majority of the Western context. Here's the thing, we think within the context of Europe, this is at a tipping point. There is arguable debate between those on the side of extremists who want to remove all forms of religious freedom, and there are those who defend Islam because of examples, like Mahdi Hassan, the person that Mubarak gets most of his arguments from anyways, because he's a Muslim who is visible on Al Jazeera, and he is a prominent former debater. He graduated from Oxford. These are people we can point to and say that these people, like Muslims, are part of our society. They can integrate well within us, and those examples are now lost. When Mahdi Hassan can no longer say Assalamu alaikum when he comes on to Al Jazeera. No, thank you. But finally, let's look at what some of the policy implications are at the point in this debate when you remove all visibility of Muslims. You discourage Muslims now who come from overseas, immigrants and migrants who want to come for a land of opportunity, of success, to better their family and their life. They no longer want to come to Europe now. They are more likely now to keep themselves and their families in a state where they will die, in Iraq, in Syria, because now they feel that even those countries where I was supposed to be accepted and finally be able to A, practice my religion freely, B, be able to economically expand myself, I now have to choose between the two, which is just as bad a situation as they're in now. Some of them may choose to die. What ends up happening is they never migrate. Hundreds of people, thousands of millions die as a result of this. But more importantly, the diversity that creates Western culture, that makes it so great, that allows it to be able to take from different cultures and expand and have those things there, no longer happens. You end up with a Europe that is whitewashed to the point of non-existence. We think this is a harm on their side. But finally, we tell you that the spiritual fulfillment that you say, nothing that was never responded to by them. They say, well, look, spiritual fulfillment isn't as important as getting welfare. We've already negated that welfare is the biggest thing for people. But we tell you that spiritual fulfillment is critically important. When you tell people, you might as well come up here and say, we don't want you to be Muslim at all. Essentially, that's what this policy said. We don't want Muslims in this country. We don't want Jews in this country. We don't want anyone who is different from the Christian majority in this country. What that means is those things are reversing the decades of progress we have made, and we will never get those back. When that is the image that everyone in society are left with, I have never been prouder to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for his speech, and I'll call upon the member of Parliament to extend the case inside closing up.
Ladies and gentlemen, the freedom to express via religion, we agree, is an inherent right. But we also believe that religion is a lifestyle that people choose to practice. At the point in which you want to engage in that lifestyle, the ability for you to be alive and for you to have a sustainable livelihood is a prerequisite for you to be able to participate in religion, to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. Opening government, declared here in this debate that leaders can do it. We will enter this debate and argue why religious leaders have a duty to strongly encourage in order to create so that we can strategically engage and ensure the longevity of the practitioners as well as the minority religion Mubarak calm down. As a person who was placed on a no-fly list for having a Muslim name, it is shameful for Hazm to belittle the discrimination that exists for individuals in this country, ladies and gentlemen. we argue and we contend that the problem in Europe, whilst it may be in specific countries, is problematic in nature. The ability for people to feel like they can actualize within that country doesn't just stop at the point in which you achieve spiritual enlightenment, but it's also the ability for you to politically and socially mobilize within that country. I think that's important as well. So we argue that Europe is really bad, right? But even in the most nicest country like United Kingdom, oftentimes people face pressure to live in immigrant and ethnic enclaves because they believe that their acceptance of that religion isn't something that is necessarily important. If we accept under your context that came out in Hazem's speech that it isn't so bad, so why then the discussion won't happen if people can still engage in a moderate discussion with you? This debate operates in a world in which the discussion is contentious. No thank you, sir. So let's move on to a few points of rebuttal. Firstly, on disenfranchisement, right? We agree that it's not a contentious thing that people are disenfranchised. But we believe that the ability to identify as a religious person doesn't disappear at the point in which you can't engage in PDFs for the sake of the debate, right? Because we believe that the ability for you, and they very well agree and accept that at the point in which you engage in PDFs, that it limits the ability for you to actualize as a human being, because people can very well physically tag you to a specific religion and viscerally attack you on that, right? Opening opposition also agrees that visibility isn't an absolute need. But we will have to argue, ladies and gentlemen, at the point in which you have to make transaction costs in how people perceive you as a community, visibility is something that we're very willing to sacrifice at the point in which you can protect those individuals with the status quo, ladies and gentlemen. Lastly, on this point of visibility and Mehdi Hassan being a good thing, we agree that Mehdi Hassan is a valuable person in status quo, but the reason why he is a good speaker and a good person to moderate a discussion is because people don't immediately tag him to the tag of being a Muslim, because he doesn't have a physical identifier as well as physically publicly identifying with your faith, ladies and gentlemen. We need to allow for people to be able to come to the discussion at a moderate position. No thank you, stop heckling, sirs. So firstly, how do we enter this debate? Firstly, when you're a person of a religious minority, it's not just about being able to practice your religion. Often we are talking about, specifically in this context, immigrants as well as refugees that are coming into Europe because there's a calculation of protection that they need. So what do they want? Beyond things like spiritual enlightenment, we argue that they want things like political recognition, economic and social mobility, as well as safety. This is where we will discuss the hierarchy of rights and priorities that exist in status quo. Oftentimes, we need to, as a collective community, make calculated trade-offs to ensure that we can achieve a meaningful position in society. So let's first argue, what was the calculations that were made by these individuals when they choose to travel to Europe, given the fact that they had to travel long and arduous journeys in order for them to reach these areas to begin with? It isn't for spiritual enlightenment, ladies and gentlemen, because these are individuals who either face oppressive regimes or oppressive situations that disallows the ability for them to even be alive to practice their livelihood to begin with. That is why, even though Muslims know there are potential of xenophobia that exists in Europe, it's a calculation that they made, but the fact of the matter is there is a trade-off that they are willing to make in terms of safety and amendability in that specific region and in that specific context, ladies and gentlemen. That is why they chose to go to Europe, even though they recognize there is a potential harm that can accrue to me. So, secondly, role of religious leaders in this specific context. We will argue that as a religious leader, you have to protect your followers. No, thank you, sir. You have to ensure there is a cohesive ability for you to also protect that faith. At the same time, ensure a sustainable environment of safety for your practitioners to be alive in that particular regard. Secondly, sometimes you as a religious leader have to make hard decisions in how you preach and what you tell your followers to do. We see them do this all the time, right? I.e. things like the ability for you to interpret faith in a different manner, which distinctly separates you from other schools of thought. The ability for you to lead your congregation and telling them this is what you need to do in order for you to be a good person. So this leads me to my second part, and thank you. Why are PDFs make it a lot harder for you to translate to acceptance, ladies and gentlemen? So firstly, how do people identify you at the point in which you are engaging in PDF? Oftentimes, we think that human beings on a primal and on a visceral level rely on physical identifiers to create a visceral association to who you are as well as what you do in status quo. It is regrettable, but it still happens. That's why things like the beards and burqas and yarmulkes create an immediate association to who you are as a person and not who you are as a human being, ladies and gentlemen. We think that the calculation then becomes, how do we allow for them to sustain themselves as human beings given the context of what they're operating in? We think that people are often split by prejudices that are conceptualized and created by perverse incentives in the media. Fox News, for God's sakes, used stock image from 6 years ago of people shouting Allahu Akbar to engage in a inculcation instillation of fear in that particular regard. Given that perverse incentives are powerful rhetoric that people can utilize, we think that they have to ensure that their congregation members engage in this policy. I'll take one.
In the status quo, Germany has opened its doors to Muslim migrants where Hungary has closed it. But in your world, you tip the rhetoric in favor of the biggest.
Okay.
When will you ever be able to reinstate the right to be Muslim?
Firstly, we will argue that even in the context of Germany, this argumentation of we need to protect European Christians first has worn out. That is why Germany have engaged in policies of like restricting the ability for migrants to come in now. At first, they were nice, but they're not really anymore, right? But secondly, in order for us to create incentive structures for them to want to engage genuinely with us and allow for some degree of protection to exist, as a community that is that practices minority religion, we will have to take a position of being the bigger person. It's really hard, I agree. But we think that in order to ensure a sustainable environment of safety, we will have to show that we aren't entrenched in dogmatic positions and unwilling to make compromises and moderation in our position, ladies and gentlemen. That we can show that secular values isn't something that we vilify and treat as the devil, that is something that is valuable as well. In status quo, these minority religious practitioners are viewed as heretics, viewed as a rebel, and viewed as bastards that should not be in our region and should not be in our country. In order to ensure that there's some degree of sustainability and moderation that can exist in the discussions that we have to make that hard decision and then transactional cost in how we present ourselves. I've never been prouder to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Member of Town for speaking of all of the member of opposition to
So the last time we were live stream, I told my mom, so now like 15 little Filipinos in a small house are watching this. So, hello. Oh, where's the live stream? Hello. So let's begin. This is actually a bit close to the heart of it. That's why I said hi to my family. Because my grandfather, a while back, was actually a Muslim. But in the Philippines, there was a lot of violence against Muslims. So little by little, he tried to not practice it in public because he didn't want to get beaten up as a child. But then furthermore, what he did was he converted to becoming a Catholic. That's why today I stand before you as a Catholic. Years later, this strategy was so unviable. We still don't have enough madrasas in the Philippines. Mosques don't suddenly spring up because it is still significantly harder, especially when we say that they don't practically exist. That all legislations do not need the data, that all statesmen, when a Muslim dies in the Philippines, can just say, well, he's not a Muslim, there are no signs he's a Muslim, she's not wearing a hijab, so it's easier for them to deny it. And that is what our extension is going to be. We hate this whole there will be spaces thing from government side, carried by closing government, which means very much. Firstly, we will say that there is really no physical identifier for those who are religious, which means it is easier to deny when abuse does happen to religious individuals. Secondly, we say there really are no spaces. Given the context that Sadat himself gave, there really are no political, economic, and social spaces, and that's why they must lose this debate because their alternative is not going to work in their own context. But lastly, we say, if you hide religions, you don't evolve religions. It makes it easier for religions to be infallible because no other individual can talk about them. But first, a couple of things we want to remind. We will actually take it more and say that this is about the strategy of religious leaders. We agree that each person will have their own religious values or whatever as closing government to say, but this is about as a religious leader, how can you get more people in your congregation accepted? They say that the way to do that is you say that you are one of them, and then if you are one of them, you suddenly backstab them with, oh, by the way, I'm a Muslim. And that's really an unviable strategy. How does that even work? Does the imam in your mosque go like, oh, don't tell them, but 3 years from now, just go, yes, I am a Muslim. This is not a real political strategy, ladies and gentlemen. This is banked on the hope that someday, somehow, a Muslim who is so used to not talking about this religion will probably know when to talk about this religion. So it's an unviable strategy. But secondly, given the context, that they are being killed, no legislation is being given to them, that she actually didn't get into a plane, means that there are other ways they can identify that you are a Muslim. Which means that they say it's completely impossible for Muslims to get a job in Hungary. How in the world are they going to be a CEO or some managerial position if the context itself dictates that it's impossible? So there's no way, there's no access given that context. So maybe the whip over there can fix that tension. Sit down. Lastly, Are politics and economics actually as accessible as your hijab? We don't think so. Later on, we will argue that politics and economics are actually the most elitist institutions in the world, and it's harder to defend your religion given those kinds of things. Secondly, they want to say spiritual fulfillment doesn't really matter. We disagree. Well, we're not being consistent with the first thing we said about strategy. What we're saying is they're actually displacing a lot of our members who are brave enough to wear that hijab. We just want to say that because we think that in this debate, it's not about the strategy, but we are about speaking for those individuals who cannot speak for themselves. And that is why we had the lunch of Remember. Lastly, they say people are going to get killed. We think that there are strategies not to be killed. And practicing in public, well, the nature in public is such, is that there are other people who can be witnesses to your death. Which means that it is not completely impossible to just go like, he killed this person. Ladies and gentlemen, what this means is that it is not always true that people will always just ultimately die when they wear a hijab. They can strategically position where they will practice them if it is a protest. But second, she is also inconsistent for her own extension. She said you can still protest politically and you can also go to the media, which is the same thing as practicing your religion in public and publicly saying that you are a Muslim. But the third response is the question, how will you tell people you are a peaceful Muslim? This is how you do it. I am a peaceful Muslim. You just say that in public. You just say that in the camera like this. This camera over here. You can say that. When people start interviewing you, when people start talking to you, you can just say that you are a peaceful individual. You can, even if this person over there is not listening to me, I can scream it to her and she will probably still hear it. That is the beauty of public practice.
Yes. If this debate is really about increasing religion and private, aren't more Muslims going to convert out when they are forced between two routes? The religious saying, a religious leader saying, if you don't need to go to hell, another person saying, if you do this, I'll discriminate you.
You know, it's bad when we think that the power of religion is about getting more subscribers. It is about getting more rights for religions. In the process, we will lose more members, correct. But these are about those individuals who are ready to show themselves as Muslims, who are ready to practice their religions. If you are afraid, then we will agree that your God will forgive you about not practicing them. But the question is, and what this debate is trying to talk about is a religious leader, the person who should have defended that faith, and how should he defend it? Firstly, what we'd like to say is that there are individuals, that it is easier to deny abuses against religions and say that there's no dimension of hate crime. If people who die or are subject to hate crimes actually become devoid of their identity as religious. Sit down. First, what does that mean? It means that if I am a parliamentarian in Hungary, what will likely happen is if a person or a man is dead, it is so easy for me to tell the media he died because of some XY reasons, but never say that there is a religious discrimination going on in that society. In comparison, if an African American does die, we can easily point out that there must be some form of racial discrimination because it is easily identifiable. See, we're getting their concept using against them. What we're trying to say, ladies and gentlemen, is we're not saying that this is the only way to identify hate crimes and get data for hate crimes, but it does become much, much harder for individuals to deny that dimension, especially if it can be published in public. If it is not published in public, it makes it easier for people to say that it does not exist, we should never talk about it, and you are dead for some random reason, and we can even just let go of it. That doesn't correct the crime itself, that doesn't correct the motive, and that doesn't correct the reason why it happened. Secondly, creating accessible spaces for discourse. They said politically, economically, you can just be one of them. That's insane. Politically, you have no parliamentarians, and because you are a minority, the nature of minorities is that you have a small number, you can never get elected. Economically, probably not a lot of you have jobs. You don't have enough capital to create your own jobs. What does that mean? It means that there is no way for you to access and fight for your religion in those specific places, right? It means that secondly, it is also inaccessible because politics is mostly academic, and economics is probably, you need a lot of money. Why do you need your hijab therefore? Because if in all of these places, you will never have the ability to talk about your religion, the only thing that you can use for yourself, the only resource that you actually have is your hijab. The only resource that you actually have is your religion itself in the public practice, because all other public spaces have already been closed. In the end, your religion actually cannot even evolve. And simply because if you cannot talk to another individual about what is wrong about your religion, because you are forced to hide it, it is easier for your imams to tell you random things that you will have to follow. Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is more than just about getting to a semifinals. This is about understanding. It's true, I'm not kidding you. But it's also more about knowing how it is that individuals can speak when they are always silent.
Thank the number of opposition for his speech and all the
it is a well-known fact that our rights are never created in a vacuum, and it must be evaluated based on the context and nuances of the current situation. With this regard, we think it's negligible for a CEO to come out here and say that we rehashed OG when she didn't necessarily pick out the nuances in Jay's speech. So while OG necessarily told you what kind of rights we'll fight for, Jay specifically mentioned in her speech how is it best or how is it attainable for us to strategically position ourselves in order to get those rights. Those were the nuances that were missing. Chill, right? Firstly, let's talk about the concession that came out from Abo's speech, right? He mentioned that we have to approach things in a strategic way. Therefore, he is okay with us practicing in some areas, but then again, not okay with us practicing with other areas. We think that this is a concession on his part, telling us that yes, sometimes areas might be dangerous for us to practice, therefore we must limit our exposure of this display of faith to these people. So we think that in general, if the entire Europe is dangerous on your side, therefore your premise then falls as well. So I'll deal with this debate in three ways, right? Firstly, let's talk about acceptance and the context of which this debate happens. Secondly, let's talk about the role of religious leaders. And thirdly, let's deal with this wacky extension about hate crimes and how they're planning to use religious identifiers and battering rams for more rights. And we think that that's wrong. Let's talk about the first thing, right? About the context and acceptance. Because the entire side opposition is predicated on the fact that people will get angry and that people are unable to spiritually fulfill. Let's think about this for a minute, right? Is the main consideration of them moving all the way to countries like Hungary, all the way to countries like in Europe, all about spiritual fulfillment? Let's think about it. The fact that you have to make a 1,000-mile journey all the way from Syria to Hungary. The fact that you have to go onto onto boats or onto boats that are very dangerous, and the journey itself, that you might be harmed by extremist groups along the way. These are all considerations they take not to reach spiritual fulfillment, which they could have done in any other Middle Eastern country, but they chase countries in Europe so they can reach some form of political stability or security in these areas. They know that they can practice in private within these spaces in peace with speaker. We think that this is important because this shows that spiritual consideration isn't the primary consideration when these people move forward. Couple that with the analysis, with further analysis that you can practice in private and that it's not necessarily that you have to go through it in public. Because they know that these areas are Christian dominated, that it has a huge Christian rhetoric, right? Therefore, they know the moment they step in, there is going to be a stigma on that. So acknowledging this characterization, we don't think it is harmful for an imam or a rabbi to come up and say that, look, maybe spiritual fulfillment in public should be limited. Because you can at least keep yourself safe if you pray at home or if you read the Torah at home. We think that that is extremely important in this debate. Secondly, they wanted to talk about things like extremism, right? We think in status quo, all your harms are already happening, right? So you homogenize things like Islam with things like terrorist groups. But there is no counter-narrative to show that we can be moderate on your side. At least when Islamic leaders come up and say that you should adopt some form of secular narrative, that gives people the idea that you can engage with these people, that you shouldn't homogenize. That was exactly what Jay said in her speech. That was completely misengaged with side closing opposition. Lastly, let's deal with the fact of how do you garner this sort of acceptance. Because the fault of side opposition is they never told you what interest does a xenophobic European have in engaging with a Muslim man who is wearing who is carrying a prayer mat, for example, or a rabbi who's wearing the Star of David. They never told you why we would engage with these people, right? But we told you that at least when you're able to compromise, show some form of compromise, then these xenophobic people, feel like they have some form of control and some form of ability to moderate this discussion because you are the bigger person. And you approach the table saying, look, I'm not that bad. You may be able to scream, I'm not a peaceful Muslim from afar, but you're screaming, so they're probably thinking you're something, bad. But secondly, secondly, the fact that you have a big beard or like you're carrying a prayer mat or a Quran, people will immediately identify you as a terrorist more than you being able to approach them first and them being able to feel comfortable to approach you. That's the compromise that Jay said in his speech that was never engaged on inside closing opposition. Secondly, sit down. Secondly, let's talk about this. I'm going to jump in issue. Let's talk about hate crime, right? Because this is what they wanted to say. Now, if you can physically identify these people, then you can use them to identify whether or not it's a hate crime or not. We think this is a poor excuse for using them as battering rams in order to forward your own goals, and we think that's harmful. Secondly, we think there are other ways you can identify an identity of a religious minority without him publicly practicing, like identity cards, like the fact that he was killed in a community of Muslims. Witnesses, maybe, I don't know. These are all other things that can indicate that it was a hate crime or not. Whether or not it was out of malice, whether or not there was a defect, I don't know. These are all other instances where you can still fulfill your goal, and you don't have to come to an instance of harming that individual in a xenophobic country to begin with. But before I move on, Hassan.
Given you want Muslims to compromise to the point of not even being Muslims, the judges in this room are waiting to hear how you ever change that perspective.
I can be a Muslim by going home and praying 5 times a day. I can be a Muslim by practicing the fasting ritual every Ramadan at home. I don't have to go out and preach the azan to all of you in order to be a Muslim. That is the fact that we've been trying to pray, that we've been trying to tell you, that we can be a Muslim in our own private sphere, and when it's harmful to you, why not just limit it to that private sphere of his speaker? They've never been able to deal with that. Lastly, let's deal with the fact the leader bit, right? Because they would argue that the point of a leader is to encourage more people into their congregation. But we argued in contrast that in order for you to do this, you have to make sure that your religion is sustainable and you're able to practice in peace. With this regard, we feel it's better for leaders who have a power over this religious minority to be able to shape and to be able to be a point of reference in order to fix or in order to engage with this compromise, Ms. Speaker. We think with this regard, that is the point of a leader that Jay was trying to bring. That it doesn't have to be the quantity of people you bring in, but the quality of life they can maximize in these instances. So yes, you can still pray. So yes, you can still fast. But when people are threatening your lives just because you do that in public, we don't think leaders should immediately tell you to put yourself in front of the barrel of the gun. I am very proud to propose.
I thank the author for his speech and for his speech and call upon the author to conclude this debate.
When beliefs and expressions shift from public spaces to the private sphere, what we contended was that discrimination and conflict does not disappear. It only becomes invisible. In our extension, we told you that the problem with hidden and invisible tensions is that firstly, it entrenches discriminatory thoughts without the ability to challenge it out in the open. And secondly, it removes the remaining spaces that these minority groups still cling on to, something that closing government simply poo-poos away. We told you that religion at its root is a public institution, a public experience. You violate the true ability to evolve that religion to be what it is when the moment you tell these religions that it has to be a private religion. We don't want that under our side. I have 2 issues to address this debate. Firstly, how do we best change public perceptions of minority religions? And secondly, does your need to be free from persecution trump your religious expression? Firstly, how do we change public perceptions? The first question we have to ask about this is, where does the discrimination really come from? They wrongly believe in the affirmative bench that it is rooted in your public displays of your faith. That is wrong. The reason why people don't like Muslims is because the dominant narrative on the media is that Islams are terrorists. Is that they're brainwashed to believe that Muslims are violent. The importance of this is that that does not disappear under the affirmative model. The dominant narrative will still exist. Meaning, people will still oppose you the moment they realize you are Muslim. Meaning, the moment they do find out where you go to pray, they will realize that you are Muslim and they will still want to attack you. What exactly was the importance of this? It means that in the best case scenario for the affirmative bench, it is very tokenistic of a benefit. only a few Muslims will really be protected. Because there will still be discrimination and persecution, but in their best case, they have also removed the ability for Muslims to determine for themselves whether they wanted to take on that burden. Comparatively, under our model, we told you in our best case, it allows society to see you as a moderating force. A good person and see that you are a Muslim, and therefore they can associate that good people can also be Muslim, and Muslims can also be good people. But in the worst case that we talked to you about, they will still discriminate you, but at least we will know that it was a form of religious discrimination. It's not as easy as how government whip told you that the police can still investigate it. Especially when you characterize the context where the government themselves don't even like the Muslims to begin with. It is easier for the police to say, no, it is not a hate crime. It is easier for them to continue to silence these types of Muslims so that they can never really mobilize themselves and say that these types of crimes do exist, that hate crimes do exist, and that Muslims are being persecuted. In our worst case, where they are being persecuted, what we would say is that it gives us more tools as a Muslim community to say that we have to fight for more rights, that we are able to get the rights that we want, and that's how we're going to be able to attain it under our model. No thank you. But secondly, under this issue, they told us that the problem is that public displays removes all incentive for the majority to even interact with Muslims. Firstly, we would say that it's true that to an extent there are individuals who will not want to interact with you once they see you wearing a hijab or once they see you going to a mosque. But you have to be realistic in this debate. Are all people in Europe, which is also a Western liberal democracy context, where people have also been rationalized to believe that people can also be tolerant of other faiths and beliefs, really going to act like that? Like, for example, when the Charlie Hebdo massacre occurred, people may have also opposed the Muslims, but there were also a significant number of Christians and Catholics who wanted to support Muslims and were willing to defend them. Those things will still exist on our side. There will still be a level of interaction under our model. But furthermore, what we have to say is that there will be a number of Muslims, yes, who will naturally not express their faith in the open because of the context they set up. They are scared. They will know, of course, that they will be persecuted in the open. Those are the people we're talking about. We're talking about people who do know that context, who do know that they may be persecuted once they publicly display their faith, but yet are comfortable with that. They know that they are capable, that they might be discriminated, that their hijab might be stripped off of them, but they are comfortable with that and know that they can bear the consequences of that. We question, why exactly do you have to, what right exactly do these religious leaders still have to say that these individuals are not making a rational and calculated decision? We think it is unfair if you're taking it away from them the ability to actually determine what exactly is best for their faith. But lastly on this issue, are all Muslims really homogenized? To an extent, they will be homogenized on either model. The problem we presented to you, and it wasn't our burden to say that they won't be homogenized under our side, but we told you they'll be more homogenized under their model. Because the state has practically labeled them and silenced them as terrorists. That these Muslims cannot interact in the public sphere. Because we already told you, like from Abbott, that they no longer have the political, economic, and social capacity to do so. Their only ability to express themselves as Muslims is by actually expressing their own faith. And you remove that ability and capacity for them to destroy that homogenization the moment you silence them and you invisibilize them. But before I move on,
we do acknowledge the Muslims will have to come out in the future. But is it better for the Muslims to have a job, engage in that friendship first, focus on commonalities first, and then once you have that base, only then you focus on the differences?
Firstly, it's not as if all Muslims will have no jobs at all. That's why there are Muslims in Europe who do have jobs. Secondly, what we would say is if they are comfortable with that persecution, or they're comfortable with not getting jobs or just getting low-paying jobs, then that was a risk and a trade-off that they were willing to make. Why is it ultimately that these religious leaders have to dictate what exactly was the trade-off that should have been made? No, thank you. And this leads precisely to the second issue. Does your need to be free from persecution really trump religious expression? Because those in government told us that in order to preserve your lifestyle or your religion, you need to be alive. First, for 3 levels of response. Firstly, as we already told you, you do not really protect their life under their model. They will still be abused and they will still be persecuted. Secondly, under our model, we obviously still can protect lives. It is illegal to rape. It is illegal to kill. It is illegal to discriminate. These types of persecutions are insidious and hidden oftentimes. What you do under their model is you make it more likely to be hidden and harder to regulate. Because at least under our side, it is easier to determine that it was a hate crime. It is easier to determine that these Muslims are being persecuted. And that's where we lead to the third level of response. The question really is, if you're saying that they can at least live their life, the question is what exactly is the quality of life they're going to have under their model? Because we already told you coming from Apple that they do not have the political, economic, and social capacities. What they have left is their faith. And the moment you tell them that they have to invisibilize that faith, the moment you tell them they cannot express that faith, you remove the one thing that they have left. Perhaps under their model, the state has already abandoned them. What we provide them is at least, if they're being abandoned by the state, their God should not abandon them as well. We think that only makes it a lot worse under their model. When you continue to invisibilize all of these problems, we're very proud.
Yeah, I know. Ben, yeah,
That's yours.
Huh?
That's yours.
Hold on.